Come along with us as we explore the broad world of preservation and the work being done to preserve, interpret, and save our past in a 21st century world. From aquaculture to historic foodways to forensic modeling, we're talking weekly with experts from across the globe. This is your host, Nick Redding. Welcome to PreserveCast. This is Nick Redding. You're listening to PreserveCast. Excited to be sitting down with somebody who gets digital communication for preservation in a very in-depth way. We're talking with Cristiana Pena, and we're going to be talking with her all about her work and how she has really carved out an interesting niche for herself in the preservation world and some of the cool projects and programs and efforts that she's been a part of. But before we get there and we talk about her work, we love to get to know folks. So before we do all that, let's get to know you, Cristiana, and let's know a little bit about yourself. Where'd you grow up? What led you to this kind of work? And, you know, why were you interested in preservation and why this aspect of preservation?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Nick. I'm excited to talk to you a little bit and hopefully hear some other listeners weigh in about how they've also kind of created like special little niches for themselves in preservation. That's always fun to hear from others. But I grew up, I'm from the Midwest originally. I grew up in South Dakota, where my parents still live. My dad is retired Air Force, and so we were actually stationed abroad when I was born. And then when I was 5, my parents were stationed at a base in South Dakota, and that's where I was until I graduated and went to high school. And it's funny because I always hear people talk about like, oh, well, I grew up in an old house. It's just in my bones. I've lived it for so long. And I grew up in base housing and then just like track housing, like nothing necessarily especially character rich. And I don't know if that might, in at least a small measure, contribute to why I kind of sought that out, because it always felt so special because it wasn't my daily exposure necessarily. So seeing it just, felt very romantic and whimsical and just like so, open to, what's the background, what's the history of these kinds of styles and these kinds of places. So yeah, I think that's kind of why even though it wasn't necessarily at my fingertips growing up, I was always excited to kind of seek it out.
That's interesting. I mean, I think that's it's sort of a unique take on it. You hear that sometimes. We just did an interview recently with somebody who lived overseas, and they then were just like enthralled with American history when they got back. Like they just needed more of it. Like they were just like, wow, I missed out on all of this growing up. I think they grew up in like Hong Kong. But so you make the decision growing up in South Dakota, kind of bouncing around the Midwest. Although from my perspective as a Marylander, South Dakota is firmly in the West. So where did you end up going to school, and what did you go to school for?
Yeah. So I ended up going to Penn State, to the main campus in State College. And literally, it's so funny to look back and think how naive we all were. But in my thinking, I was like, I'm going to go to this Big Ten school. I'm too big for this little town. I'm going to a bigger town. And then I got to State College and I was like, this is at least a third the size of the town I was leaving. I'm so confused, but it's a huge college town, but it's still a small town. So I thought I was leaving small town South Dakota for the big time. And it was not necessarily that in reality. But the great thing that ended up happening is I went to Penn State. My major was art history. And in such a big school that's like so big on like tech and engineering and those kinds of things, the art history department was so small. So I was able to, in this huge school, still have classes, seminar classes with 6 people and a professor. And so I was able to really get deep into the things about art history that I was curious about, really like from the beginning of my time there. And it was in that time that I just constantly saw myself gravitating towards architectural history whenever I was, looking for what I wanted to study. And so I thought, well, maybe it's not art the way I was thinking, painting, sculpture. Maybe it's really the built environment is the thing that I'm gravitating towards more. So I really just kind of let myself pursue that as much as I could at undergrad. And then when it came to grad school, was looking at, well, I don't want to be an architect. Like, I don't think like that's not my strength. I'm not necessarily a designer. So what are my other options? And just through research, found historic preservation as an option at Columbia and thought I'd give it a go. And so here we are.
So you went to Columbia. You finally found the big city.
Yes, exactly. And it's funny. I mean, I should give myself more credit, but I took a year off between undergrad and graduate school I was a language assistant in France, teaching English as a second language to high school students. And I was in France when I applied. So I applied like with a French mailing address, and that's where I was when I was accepted. And then I remember at orientation, my first year at Columbia, there was another student there who was international. And he was like, "Oh, I heard that there's a French student here. I can't wait to meet them." And I was like, "Oh, me too. I can't wait to meet them. I just got back from France." And then as we were meeting everybody at orientation, I was like, "I'm the French student. I'm the one." And I was like, I hope they didn't just think that they were like admitting like some very fabulous like French person into the program, and they got this South Dakota like, little person, whatever. It worked for me. It all worked out in the end. But I just thought that was funny that everybody was like excited for this non-existent student. And then here I show up.
Well, Columbia definitely got some bang for its buck in terms of an alumnus, because you've done some really cool things after it. But I'm curious, what were you imagining that you were going to do? Because we're going to kind of talk about this sort of interesting niche, and it's not even really a niche anymore, but the work that you do in preservation to tell the story of preservation. So it's sort of this meta conversation because we're telling preservation stories, and then we're going to tell a preservation story about telling preservation stories. But what were you initially thinking about doing, and then how did you land your first job, and what did that look like?
Yeah. I mean, I think that I had like the most romantic ideals of I was going to be, in the depths of a library, researching old things with books that smell wonderful. And I was going to be, walking through cathedrals. That's what I thought I was going to do. I don't know how I thought I was ever going to pay for that life, but that was in my mind. And then it was at Columbia, when I had a couple of internships throughout the city, and I started, I knew that there were a couple of tracks that just didn't interest me. Hands-on materials conservation was not for me. So I didn't go in that direction. There were other folks who were kind of going more like the land use policy, really directly with a semi kind of, urban planning legal track. Interesting. And I definitely have dabbled as like since then, but as kind of an initial focus was also not really for me. So I kept leaning towards kind of documentation, interpretation, and advocacy was always kind of part of that. So I started interning at some different organizations. And my first internship at a small nonprofit on the Upper West Side of Manhattan became my first job and was really my trial by fire. I mean, yes, we learned so much in school, and we were very fortunate that New York City is really your classroom and your lab. You can test so many things out and learn so much on the ground. But I was at that first job for 5 or 6 years. And I just learned so much about like real world, quote unquote, preservation. You learn about it in one way, but how does it actually pan out? And that was really when the kind of communications element started to make its way in, because so often, you run a nonprofit too, that budgets are tight. And so you don't necessarily have thousands and hundreds and whatever of dollars to be telling people about all the good work you're doing, but you need people to know about all the good work you're doing so you can afford to keep doing it. And so it happened to just be kind of when social media was really starting to be viable for those kinds of purposes. I mean, we were all really kind of taking the bull by the horns and say, for absolutely no dollars, I can tweet about this and I can post about this and I can, tag everybody else. I can let all the reporters know. I can let all these people know what we're doing. And it was, kind of like a lot of things like right place, right time, that I think I really got to be doing that early on and to be a part, at least in our little preservation world in the city, of how we're nonprofits, how we're preservation professionals leveraging those tools to get the message out. And just the more I would start to see success with it, the more I wanted to be better at it and just do more of it. So I was just, constantly trying to find opportunities to, do special projects within the organization I was working for at the time to just show like how purposeful that could be. So that was really kind of where it got started for me.
Yeah. And I think, we were saying before we even hit record that like preservation, you were saying preservation is like one of the most multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary kind of fields that you can go into. And I think a lot of people sort of have that vision. Maybe it's not so much romantic, maybe it's naive, maybe you're just not familiar with what the world looks like yet, but like you're just going to be traipsing around historic places and doing all these things. And like I always joke that I'm like, I work in Outlook. That's sort of like my that's my preservation tool. But there's different roles for all of us, and telling the story is just so important. Just getting your story out there about like, this is the work that you're doing. This is why we're saving this building. This is why this district or this nomination matters, and this is why the work matters. not just why the place matters, but this is why the work matters, because we, build community, there's jobs, there's all these different things that are sort of these added on benefits. But unless you have a platform to tell that story, then it's sort of like if a tree falls in the forest, it doesn't make a sound.
I mean, otherwise you're just waiting for, your press, whatever that might be, to also care enough to give you some space. And I mean, especially, in New York City, when your hometown paper is the New York Times, like that can be difficult. Like, you're not going to land on the Metro section cover every single time. But yeah, totally. I mean, it's funny because after working on the Upper West Side, then I worked just for 2 years at a historic cemetery in the Bronx, Woodlawn Cemetery, which was one of the most incredible jobs I've ever had. I loved it so much. And that was another example where I was like, oh, I'm just going to be, wandering among the monuments. And like, yes, we get to lead tours and interpret this space and talk about its conservation and work with historians and work with materials conservators. And it's so great. But say again, if you're not making sure everybody knows all these amazing things you're doing, then they think that the cemetery is kind of taking care of itself. And I think like that's with all preservation, right? Nobody realizes that there's somebody behind the scenes making this building stand up for all time that needs your support, and it's not doing it just by happenstance on its own. So even once I, was shifting and kind of finding myself trying new things in preservation, still the communication side of it was huge. I mean, you can do all the programming you want around a historic site, but like making sure like the local news and the cable access and the neighborhood-based papers and the local bloggers, making sure everyone knows what you're doing and talking about it constantly is just necessary. Otherwise, you're doing all this great stuff for just, like you said, tree in the forest.
Yeah. And so you go from, it's all reinforcing what we've heard so many different times and what we feel. So it's well said. I mean, it's so you go from kind of working for organizations to working for a basketful, and one prominent client, I don't know if you're willing to talk about clients and things like that, and a former guest that we've had on with cheap old houses and all that sort of thing. Do you want to talk about sort of the experience there and how you got hooked up with that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, so after leaving Woodlawn Cemetery for years, I had been just kind of doing, communications freelance for a number of preservation and place architecture, et cetera, related things. And I think the reason that it all really worked for me was because, yes, anyone can write a social media post, publish a tweet, but to do it with the lens of preservation, to know the language, to know the right kind of tone and tenor, especially, having done it for a historic cemetery. Now I also work with Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. And I think for that particular organization, it gave them a level of comfort to know that we're not just hiring, a communications machine. It's a person who has worked internally to this kind of organization, who would understand the way to talk about it and the sensitivities that come along with it. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, that's one example. And then we were talking about, other podcasts that I've worked with too. I've worked with 2 podcasts, one called Making Gay History, which shares the exact history that the title implies. It's first-person oral histories. And then another podcast out of Yale called Those Who Were There, which focuses on first-person testimonies of survivors and witnesses of the Holocaust. And in both of those instances, again, anyone can write copy and hit publish on something, but to really be thoughtful about how you're framing these things, I think that that's the special sauce that thankfully people recognize in me, that I could do that in a way that would just like hit the nail on the head, that there wasn't going to necessarily be a problematic learning curve, I guess. And all those kinds of those experiences, kind of grew. And the whole time, kind of parallel to all that, before there was Cheap Old Houses, to tell a little bit of the Cheap Old Houses origin story, sure, there was and still is Circa Old Houses, which is an online real estate marketplace for old houses with character, not necessarily like a price threshold the way Cheap Old Houses has. It's anything and everything all across the country. And I started working on that with Elizabeth Finkelstein because we both really went back to our early days working in advocacy. I was on the Upper West Side, just out of Columbia. She was working in Greenwich Village, just out of Pratt Institute. And we were doing similar kind of ship in the night type jobs. And when she had this idea to create Circa, mutual friends said, well, Cristiana's been dabbling on, communications in a preservation architecture space too. So maybe you two would hit it off. And we started working together on Circa oh my gosh, in like 2013, something like that. It's
Wow.
been over 10 years. And then a couple years in, the idea for, I mean, I take no credit. That was totally Elizabeth and her husband, Ethan, saw that there was really kind of a sub niche of people who wanted like the diamonds in the rough, the ones that everyone said were just, too far gone. And that's where cheap old houses came from. And it's just, has exploded and gone gangbusters. And it's just really its own phenomenon now. And so I've kind of in just the last couple of years have moved into still doing Circa work. If you see a social post from Circa, that's me. It's funny. My friends sometimes will be like, "Oh, I can tell when you write the post," and I was like, "I write all the posts. Like, I don't know what's different. It's always me.
You must really shine in some of them.
I guess, yeah. So it's just in the last couple of years I've been straddling more into the cheap old houses world as I bought my own old house, which happened to be a cheap old church, which we're converting into a residence. So it was just kind of like life is imitating art, and it kind of just put me even deeper in that world. And so I've been involved with cheap old houses on kind of special projects like their television show. They've had a book. They are working on a podcast segment as well. So working on all kinds of things kind of in that cheap old houses universe.
That's super cool. And we've had Elizabeth on, so people can go back and listen to that episode, and that's kind of got the full in-depth origin story there as well. So we're rounding out some of the Circa Cheap Old Houses team here,
Exactly.
The dream team behind it. And I've pointed out, and I think I pointed out to Elizabeth, that I think if we think about preservation in very strict terms, that a nonprofit organization that has a revolving fund is the group that saves historic houses, then that's one way of defining it. But I think as the complexity of the landscape has grown, that we have to define it differently. And I told her, and I would tell you the same thing, that I think that Circa and Cheap Old Houses is the largest historic property redevelopment program that the United States has currently, that it is saving more historic structures and more historic places than perhaps any other effort previous. And
I mean, that's incredible to hear.
I really do. I think it would be hard to argue in terms of just actual numbers. Now, maybe if you think about landmarking or putting places under protection that way, that you could make a compelling argument that you're protecting more that way. But in terms of actually getting people to buy in and save place, I think it's an amazing thing that's happening, and it shows the power of innovation, and it shows what you can do if you're willing to kind of step out of just the sort of where the rest of the group is headed. And so you've done some really cool things with that. And I thought we might take some time while we have you to, we've talked about where you've been, but a lot of people listening either want to hire you but can't afford to yet, or maybe will actually end up hiring you, which would be a great outcome of this conversation. But also are just kind of curious, like if they are a fledgling nonprofit, or they're even just sort of a middle-aged nonprofit that's still trying to find its way in this digital world. They're more familiar with sort of the tactile. Where are we right now in engaging with digital audiences? Because it seems like it changes. I'm sure what you knew and what stood as truth in 2013 is very different now.
Right.
And so,
well, and even what stood as truth, at the end of last year, the 6 months ago, 9 months ago, everything is constantly evolving, and it's especially volatile right now in terms of how different platforms are shifting, like how you can kind of best leverage them, what's even available to you. Things become more pay to play. Like it's kind of a nightmare out there sometimes. So yeah, it definitely, I don't envy anyone who might feel like they're just getting started in it or need to I don't envy them in the sense of like, it's a lot to kind of take into consideration, but it can be really worthwhile if you just kind of pause for a minute and I think kind of assess the landscape and figure out what might work for you. But I think the most important thing that I think about when it comes to how nonprofits might be leveraging digital channels. And when I say digital channels, I'm talking about primarily your social media, whether we're talking Meta, Facebook and Instagram, or Twitter/X, or TikTok, or LinkedIn. But then, of course, your website and importantly, your e-newsletter. I think one thing that's just so important is to step outside of your own preservation professional brain sometimes, because I feel like we are all so passionate and we care so deeply. And sometimes we forget that we need to bring the more casual follower kind of into the fold a little bit more before we maybe go super wonky with them or get too technical or whatever the case may be. So sometimes I think it's just really thinking about just being accessible to the layperson. I think that's one reason why Circa and Cheap Old Houses have been so successful is we don't have every single post talking about like the fine architectural details with like, the very complex terminology. Some of that stuff lands in there sometimes because we just get really excited about a feature, but we try to make sure that everyone feels like it's just egalitarian. Anyone can love an old house. You could have no clue what the difference is between Italianate and Saltbox and Victorian and any other thing, but you should be part of this because you love it. It does something inside your head and your heart. So come along for the ride. And not to say that nonprofits don't feel that way, but I think just projecting that kind of openness and welcoming as much as they can through their comms and not making people feel like, oh, well, I don't know if I belong here. Like making sure people know that, of course, like they belong here. So like you can ask like, okay, well, how do you do that? I think part of it truly, this is the boring answer, is just consistency and frequency. Like you just got to be out there pounding the pavement. You just got to do it. And also like, don't overthink it. Like sometimes it's just like, you'll put so much strategy into one post and the right angle of the photo and the right caption, and it'll kind of do middling to, whatever. And then sometimes you'll just like throw something up kind of in a flurry. It's just a beautiful shot of something with a very like one-liner caption and it goes gangbusters and it's your most, engaged thing for the week, for the month. So I think also just kind of thinking that like, yes, you want to have some strategy so that you're not just completely shooting blind, but to also remember that like social media is a space that most people just simply go to be entertained, not exclusively informed. So keep in mind that like some people just want to see beautiful things and they want to, and then you can always, give them like the meal is the beautiful thing and the little like dessert at the end or the digestif or whatever you want to call it is like your kind of subtle mission cell of like, oh, that beautiful thing that you just love so hard on that staircase, it's standing because of Preservation Maryland and our like easement program or whatever the thing may be, or like just thinking about stuff in those ways versus leading with the wonky part and hoping that they stick around to the kind of beautiful part.
I mean, it sounds sort of like kind of like an obvious statement what you just made, but I think it's really important because I think that people kind of they, like you say, I think it comes from a place of just really loving the details and being enamored with the details or the details of advocacy or sort of these things that we just get enmeshed in. And then when you go to share that information, it's just too much. And and I also think it was really smart. Like one thing that that stood out that I feel like I just want to underline and put an exclamation point on is that you just kind of have to keep doing it. And it doesn't have to be perfect. That doesn't mean that it needs to be sloppy, but it just doesn't mean that it needs to be, this really super well thought thing. And that was sort of a lead up or a follow up question to that is, I think a lot of people are just overwhelmed by the idea of creating content. How do you sort of approach that if you're talking with a new client about like content? Is it all new? Can you repurpose? What's the rule on content?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the rule is there's no rule, but at the same time, it's like the rule is if you have it, you should use it as many times as you possibly can until the wheels fall off. Because one thing you have to remember is you're putting content out there. Everybody doesn't see everything you post. So you might put something on any channel. You might put the Facebook, Instagram, whatever, wherever your space might be. That's only ever getting served to a portion of your audience. So also keep in mind that it's like, you don't want that doesn't mean that every post has to tell the same story over and over again, but it's a reminder that you don't want to tell yourself, oh, well, I posted about my podcast with Nick. I already posted it once. So I did it. Like my audience saw it. Not necessarily. Like keep finding opportunities to just mine whatever resources you have to keep putting it out there. So, if I'm promoting this podcast appearance, maybe I'll find like 3 little nuggets that I thought were really, lovely, but that we talked about. And maybe I'll extract those and do one the day that it goes out and then one a couple days later and then one a month later, just to remind people that it happened. I mean, I think that that's one thing is you can never push something too many times, and reusing content is totally fine. It is totally fine because again, Not everybody ever saw it the first time. Not everyone's going to see it the second time. So if you have something that did well in the past, you should absolutely feel comfortable reusing it, especially if it takes a burden off of your staff in terms of developing a calendar for new things. But otherwise, I think it's kind of two things. It's thinking about like what are the things that you're already putting together. You're likely already doing an e-newsletter. Likely a lot of that stuff can double in your social spaces, but with the caveat that not all things perform in the exact same form in the exact same place. So perhaps you're going to want to reevaluate your image features, or you might want to tweak the text a little bit because you just really need social to lead with more of an attention getting one-liner versus like maybe the formatting that an e-news allows. So just be thinking about things like that. Yeah, and you know, thinking about also, especially now, what you might be able to accomplish through strategic collaborations. I think that's something that we think about a lot is, you know, yes, you want to have control over certain things, but a lot of time, you know, working with your colleague organizations or influential individuals kind of in your orbit can also be great in terms of exposure to new audiences. Again, taking a little bit of the lift off of your team for one more thing they have to put together. But at the end of the day, it's like, just try it, you know, like no one's judging out here, you know, just give it a go. And if it doesn't work, archive it, delete it, put it away, move on to the next thing. Like, I think it's just like trying all the things is important as you kind of figure out what your audience is really coming to you for.
That's interesting. And I think that there's a lot in there that people should, you know, go back and listen to there. I think it's just sort of this idea that you can reuse things. I think a lot of times or people think you posted it once, that's it. And I think that is really compelling advice because you even just think about like how you experience other brands and other content and like go to their page and see all the things they posted that you haven't seen.
Totally.
Right. Because the algorithm is not allowing you to see everything because you would be overwhelmed, I suppose, if you saw everything.
Well, but I think you bring up a good point too, is like you should be looking for inspiration everywhere. Don't only look at what are the other preservation organizations doing, because they probably all have the same, you know, hurdles and challenges and kind of access that you do. Like, what are the brands that you find yourself like saying to your friends, oh my God, did you see such and such's post? That was so funny. Or did you see that? That was so crazy the way they did that, you know, that reel that had that transition in it, whatever it may be. So I think that's a good thing too, is just pay attention. I mean, it's passively, like it's around us all the time in our personal and private lives. Media is just so inescapable. So just like take mental notes sometimes. I mean, my poor phone, my camera roll is just like a graveyard of screenshots of me like seeing a post and thinking, oh, I should try that later. And like, then I do, like, I go back and think about like, okay, well, that was a shoe post, or that was I don't know, like an orange juice or whatever the thing was. But like, there was something about it that struck me as like, oh, well, that was inventive and that was thoughtful. I bet I could put some kind of old house spin on that. So I think that people should think about those things. It's just like paying attention to see what else is working, and you might be able to apply it to your content too.
So speaking of just sort of seeing what's working and what isn't, are there any things that are in social media, any things that are out right now? I mean, this is a snapshot in time. So if you're listening to this 3 years from now, take it with a grain of salt. But
not even 3 years, maybe next week. Someone's going to tell me in a week's time.
3 days. But but I'm curious, like, is there anything just in general that you're just like, that is something we don't do anymore?
Yeah, well, no, it's funny because you get so many mixed messages. Like, for example, if I lean really heavy into Instagram, which I think is probably one of the spaces that most preservation nonprofits find themselves investing the most time in, because it's where, you know, a huge audience is that's really engaged. You know, sometimes they say, oh, it's all about video, short form video through reels, video. And then in 2 weeks time, they'll be like, no, there's a return to classics. It's all about the static photo. It's all about the static photo. But the answer is it's all of the things all of the time. So I would say one thing that is out is thinking that one singular strategy, one singular type is the solution. Like, it's always going to be dabbling around and kind of, again, like doing what is going to support your content best. Because also one thing to keep in mind is one thing that is really central, I think, to success is authenticity. So if people feel like, oh gosh, like here's Nick Redding with one of these weird reels again, he's really forcing these on us, and they don't feel authentic, like people aren't going to engage. Even if you think you're picking up on every single trend, like don't chase the trends just for the sake of chasing the trends if they're not authentic to what you're bringing to the table, because people will sense that, and people will look elsewhere if that's the case.
Yeah, and that's, I've noticed that sometimes organizations, not just even in the preservation space, will just like sort of like yell at you about things.
Yeah.
It's just sort of like, our event is coming up, and like that's all. And it's like, I haven't heard from you in like 3 years, and now you're just yelling
Yeah.
at me about an event. Like, it doesn't feel authentic. It also just feels like, social media, I think, is supposed to, maybe at its best, is supposed to be a conversation. And that doesn't sound very conversational. So it's, I think it's kind of picking up on those things and understanding how best to use it. But it's, and your advice is both really helpful and also kind of maddening, where it's like, it's like, it's not one thing, it's everything. And so it's like, oh, well, good. I don't have to be good at one thing, but I have to be good at everything.
Well, and I think too, it's like, I mean, I struggle with it too, because, in addition to doing what I do professionally, like I have my own old house. I love to share it. I would love to find, like, it's not that I'm suddenly trying to be like a one woman influencer and like just be like, I'm trying to think of like someone that all the listeners might know, like a designer like Emily Henderson. Like I'm not trying to make my home necessarily a stage for all brands, but hey, I would take a free new roof if some roofing company wants to put a new roof on my house.
Are you listening out there? Are you listening?
Yeah, Bravo
She'll take
Tile.
a free roof.
I've been approaching them. Yeah. But I mean, it's in the back of a lot of people's heads. So even on your personal, like if my personal account, sometimes I'm thinking like, oh, well, gosh, I haven't posted a reel in this long. I guess I should really do that. But you know what? I had one reel that I posted on my personal account at Welsh Hall. Everyone should go follow it. And it went viral. And it was a stupid reel set to a stupid trending audio about this collection of reproduction art that I have of these little statuettes by Gainsborough called Blue Boy. It has almost 1 million views and like tens of thousands of likes. And it got me like 4 new followers, because it just goes to show that like I put very little thought into that. It went insanely viral, but it did very little for me because it was just like a weird one-off thing. And so I just bring that up because it's like kind of a warning to like be kind to yourself, because it's like I could easily say like, okay, well, the next one has to go viral. I haven't had a single thing go viral since, like, because it's just these things sometimes just happen, and there's not always a science and a special sauce to it. Sometimes it's just like right thing, right time, the right person saw it and they shared it, and that's what made it go viral. So definitely also just like be kind to yourself. Like you're really trying and you're doing your best, and it takes time. Yeah, but I do want to say one reaction I had to your point about like feeling like social channels a bulletin board versus like a conversation. I think that is one thing that I do see, especially smaller nonprofits that have an incredibly limited staff time to devote to this kind of thing. That unfortunately, I think one of the things I would love to see more groups be able to kind of update is, you're used to developing an 8.5 by 11 PDF that then you print out and you post in the library, or you post in the post office or wherever around town to let people know what you're doing. And that's great. But that same 8.5 by 11 PDF with all the small type and all the little details about your next, house tour or your annual gala or some kind of advocacy action that's coming up in the future, that's not going to translate on social. It's just not. So I think that's also a really important thing just to think about, is how you talk to your audience is both your language and your visuals. And those two things need to be customized to the space to do you like the best service.
Yeah, I think that all of this could be underlined. This is all super good. I'm taking a lot from this, and I'm sure the listeners are too. So before and I like sort of just putting a fine point on it, what's in is being kind to yourself. I like that just in general.
Yeah.
I mean that's a good thing to remember in social media and beyond. Good advice from you. So 2 questions we ask that we just dropped in. You're the first person we're going to ask for it. But, we got the 250th anniversary of the country coming up next year in 2026. And for the museum field, for the public history field, that is becoming a big thing. We're not hearing about it as much in the preservation field, and we're trying to popularize that a little bit. In a moment like that, we think back to 1976. Whoa, big deal for preservation. So many organizations got their start either as a result of the bicentennial or in the wake of it, and this upsurge in public history interest, what do you hope for the preservation movement in the 250th anniversary?
I think the key word that comes to mind, and I'm totally stealing it from Bonnie McDonald, who's the executive director at Landmarks Illinois. One of the hats I've worn in the past was as the executive director of the Fitch Foundation, and she was a fellow of the Fitch Foundation. And the project that she worked on was called a relevancy guidebook. And I think that word relevancy is it. It's like, I think that as we're looking forward to next year, the 250th, and why people should be investing in preservation then and forward, why people should be excited about what preservation is bringing to the table, is preservation has to continue to really push itself to make its relevancy to everyone as crystal clear as possible. And it kind of comes back to at the very beginning that we're also internal to it. We see it, we already know it, and we can talk about it ad nauseum, but to talk about it in a way that will feel relevant and accessible and all those things to so many more people so that we can keep growing our organizations, our donor base, our volunteer base, all of these constituencies so that we can be powerful when we have to, show up at Congress and, lobby for XYZ because we speak on behalf of this huge body of people behind us. In order to get there, we have to convince people that we're relevant and that preservation is not simply at that moment looking back at, a past glory, but how are you going to be keeping us on whatever path, we all want to be going on for the next 250, right?
That is a fantastic answer. I love Bonnie. We've had Bonnie on to talk about the Relevancy Project, and it's going to be hard for those who follow you to top that. I think relevancy is going to be one of those top words, so that's fantastic. And then before we go, we always ask everybody to make them squirm their favorite historic place or site.
Ooh, I was thinking about that. So I feel like mine has changed we moved out of the city, out of New York City, to live in the middle of nowhere in the country where we are now restoring our church house. And before then, when I lived in the city, I would say that my favorite historic place was the Bronx Zoo, because I lived in the Bronx for a number of years and it just was I lived right across the street from it. And it was just like such a destination that brought so many people together. And it was just so filled with whimsy, all those beautiful things. But I don't live there anymore. So I was thinking about, okay, well, what maybe now is one of my favorite places, historic places. And I was one of the first ones that came to mind, almost surprising myself because I haven't been back home to see my parents in a little over a year. But my parents live on the outskirts of the Black Hills, which is on the western side of the state. And they're right there kind of on the line where like the Black Hills meet the prairie. And in that space, there's a historic site called Bear Butte, which is significant with the indigenous people of Western South Dakota. And it's just such a meaningful space. And it's just right there in my parents' backyard. And I think that is something that is just so important, that all these beautiful historic spaces are around us all the time. And these ones that have deep meaning for yourself, for your communities all around you are so reachable. Like they're right there if you just go to them and seek them out. And so whenever I go to visit my parents, I just love to go there because it's such a quiet, thoughtful place. And it just really reminds you, forces you to just think about kind of your place in this bigger story of, where you live and your imprint on the spaces around you. So I'm going to say Bear Butte, South Dakota.
Fantastic. Great answer. And if anybody was curious why all these different organizations have been succeeding that you've been associated with, hopefully, I'm sure after this interview, they understand why, because you are fantastic and have done some really amazing work. You have a standing invitation. Anytime you ever want to come back to PreserveCast, we will have you. You can talk about anything you want, because I know I and the listeners would benefit from it. So Cristiana Pena, thank you so much for joining us. For people who want to get in touch with you, we'll put this in the show notes, but give us the details here too.
Sure. I'm all over the place. If you want to talk to me about cheap old houses or Circa old houses, it's my first name, Cristiana, Cristiana, no H. Keep that H out of there. It's a problem. Cristiana at Cheap Old Houses or at Circa Old Houses. And if you want to talk about other things, kind of other past advocacy lives, it's my first name, middle initial, last name, Cristiana.a.pena@gmail.com.
Cool. Well, we'll put all that in the show notes. We'll put links to some of the things you chatted about. And again, hope to have you back soon. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Nick. This was great.
Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's story, head over to preservecast.org for show notes and our collection of previous episodes. Don't forget to engage with this podcast by subscribing, commenting, and leaving a review. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at PreserveCast for even more. PreserveCast is currently recorded in Walkersville, Maryland, and sponsored by the 1772 Foundation, and powered by Preservation Maryland. Thanks for listening, and keep on preserving.